IMAX and AMC saw not huge, but sizable or noticeable revenue drops in Q4. This was to be expected. So I just want to kind of break down kind of what caused these revenue drops, and kind of look at both IMAX and AMC, because they kind of had their drops but for different reasons in some cases, and kind of just look at kind of the general health of the American box office, which I feel like kind of ties nicely from talking about the box office in our previous section. So what caused this, right? There's a few reasons. So number one is the strikes, right? So the strikes that happened last year in the spring, in the summer, and the fall, the Writers Guild and then the Screen Actors Guild. And because of that, almost more so because of the actors strike, which happened, I think, like right before Barbenheimer. It was like the week before. I think it was like literally people were on the red carpet for those films, and then like the word got out that they were now on strike, and they were like, oh, sorry, can't talk anymore, right? Because part of the strike was they weren't doing promotion for their films that they were in, which I feel like in 2024 is not as big of a thing, like going out and doing the red carpet and going on like Jimmy Kimmel. I feel like that's like for older people. Like I don't watch like these late night talk shows. I feel like that's more of like a Gen X and up kind of experience. But in any case, the studios clearly felt like it was a huge problem, because you saw as you moved into the fall and the actor strike was still going on, even after the writers had resolved their strike. Huge films like Dune Part 2, which we talked about in our box office section, that was originally supposed to come out in November. And then it got pushed to March. Which I think in some ways maybe is going to help Dune Part 2, because if it had been the same year as Oppenheimer, I feel like it would have gotten a little overshadowed, whereas now it has a little bit more breathing room. And not overshadowed in the sense that they'd be competing for market share, but just overshadowed in terms of like that conversation year end of like what was like the best movie or the biggest movie or like the biggest spectacle and all that stuff. So and in addition, that's a really big example, but there was also many smaller films delayed. So you kind of have a few of these big tent poles, and then all these little ones that, when all added together, cause kind of a big drought of content, again, for audiences to choose from, right? And that kind of ties into another issue here. Again, poor quality, right? Poor quality of options for American moviegoers. Audiences are getting tired of the same schlock over and over and over and over, right? If you look at specifically someone like Disney, they, as we've talked about in the show before, 2023 was an awful year. And maybe awful is an overstatement, but it was just, for any other small distributor, it would have been a fantastic year. But considering where Disney has come from, right? So if you look at 2019, so like that last uninterrupted pandemic year, in 2019, they had $7 billion movies. Billion with a B. 8 if you count the Spider-Man Far From Home, which was riding off the coattails of Avengers Endgame, but that was technically distributed by Sony, but Disney also got a cut of it. But in any case, that just goes to show, a stark comparison to 2023, where they had $0 billion movies, right? And again, and it's not even, you can't even say, oh, what's the pandemic, because we had like Barbie and Oppenheimer and the Super Mario Brothers movie. Like, there were successful movies that year. It's not like they didn't make $1 billion movie, but no one else did. Like, they were still at the top of the pack. No, like, they were really lagging behind, right? And then another issue that's really hurt the American box office, again, specifically in like that last quarter of 2023, again, lack of big blockbuster hits, right? So the biggest movies of 2023, on the whole, I don't have like the list up in front of me right now, but they, a lot of these big hits happened in like the first half of the year, or even like the first 2/3. So again, like Barbie. By the time October rolls around, Barbie's already come out, Oppenheimer, Super Mario Bros., Guardians of the Galaxy 3, like all of these huge hits were not even front-loaded, but by the time you get to that last quarter, there wasn't really anything that jumps out. You know what I mean? The Marvels underperformed. Aquaman, while doing okay, still underperformed compared to the first Aquaman film. So those are a few reasons why things just were not really working out for theaters. So looking more specifically, looking at IMAX, the Wrap reports a 12% drop in adjusted net income and total revenue. But Deadline notes that this was in line with Wall Street forecasts. So while this is disappointing to see the drop, it was a little bit expected, right? It wasn't like this huge shock. They also note that, the Eras Tour film and Wonka helped IMAX's, share. But again, like I said, things like The Marvels and Aquaman were, Aquaman again wasn't quite a dud. The Marvels definitely was a dud. But they were both disappointing and underwhelming in terms of their box office, strength. The Wrap also notes that they were able to hold out, IMAX was able to hold out during the strikes with international investments into like local language films. So, because again, these aren't just, we're very focused here about the American box office, but there's a whole world of moviegoers and cinemas and movies and all that. So, IMAX was kind of able to kind of weather the storm a little bit by kind of diversifying the kind of films it was playing in different parts of the world. And even with this disappointing quarter, it's still, 2023 was still one of their best years ever. I think it was the second highest at $1.1 billion. This is 25% above 2022. And from some quick math I did, it looks like about 17% of that 1.1 billion was just Oppenheimer, right? It had 3 weeks of exclusive play all over the country. But even something like Oppenheimer just still couldn't help that end of year kind of rut, so to speak. And AMC theaters were no different, right? So, unlike IMAX, which again dropped but within expectations, it from my understanding here, AMC's earnings fell below the industry analysts' projections. But the earnings still grew, right? That's the thing about a lot of this, that they still grow. It's just by how much, right? And according to AMC, like from them, this was largely due to the Eras Tour and Beyonce's Renaissance film. And Eras Tour, the film, right? So if you weren't aware, those two concert films were self-distributed through AMC. So usually, someone like Taylor Swift would work with some kind of distributor, like maybe it's Disney or Universal or Warner Brothers or whatever it might be. And then the distributor works with the exhibitor, right? And that's kind of like the flow of the process. Taylor Swift went directly to AMC and was like, you're going to distribute my film, my concert film. And because there's less parties involved, each party that is involved, there's more of the pie to share, right? There's everyone gets a bigger slice of the pie. According to AMC, this represented those two films. More so the Eras Tour. Like the Eras Tour was like made 6 times as much money as the Beyonce concert film. But again, that also was a great boost, again, because of that self-distribution model. Those two films represented about 1/9 of AMC's fourth quarter domestic box office, right? So that's a pretty sizable chunk for 2 concert films, which again are not usually huge moneymakers. Like the Eras Tour film was the 11th highest grossing domestic film in 2023. That is unheard of. I believe it's now the highest grossing concert film ever. But that's unheard of, that a film like that would make that much money, right? So it begs the question now, is this potentially a new business? Is this a novelty, or is this potentially a new business model, right? Like, could there be more direct distribution in AMC's future, whether it be other concert films or maybe just other smaller production companies just going directly to, theaters? Again, I always feel like as society develops and technology develops, we do away with middlemen, right? And I think you see that in just telecommunications, right? So now you don't necessarily need the newspapers to know stuff, even though journalism is still important, right? There is like this element of you can go on social media and people are talking about, like if there's like a big tragedy that happens, like the people there are self-reporting, right? And I wonder maybe in the future if there'll be more self-distribution with these theaters, kind of bypassing traditional distributors, whether they be really large like Disney and Universal, or even like smaller indie distributors. But again, that being said, despite the success that those concert films gave AMC, this company again still kind of fell short, right? So reportedly, the company is going to cut CEO Adam Aron's pay by 25% due to poor performance, saying, quote, that this was, quote, not a good year for our shareholders, end quote. And it's, like I said, forget the self-distribution part of this. It's clear, the industry is clearly ready to come back to a theatrical focused business model. They've realized that streaming is not going to be as profitable as they had hoped it would be. So it's clear, like, what made waves huge spectacles like Oppenheimer and to an extent Barbie, and novelty kind of concert films, with something that people are not used to seeing like this full concert. Because I think the Eras Tour film is like 3 hours long. Like, it is like this epic almost. I think in the industry is realizing that that audiences want something that they can't get anywhere else. And that's not to say that there aren't opportunities for other kinds of like films, smaller films that should still be on the big screen, but at least just from a financial point of view, that's kind of the road they want to take. We looking at some comments here. Yeah, so Viviana Metzger here notes that, Barbenheimer, Killers of the Flower Moon, The Ahsoka Show, lots of media projects couldn't do any press, so I feel like their numbers are more based on culture and quality as opposed to the most... Hold on, I'm sorry. There's like an emoji on my screen block. As opposed to most of the shows or cast interviews. Yeah, so exactly. So there's this... They kind of had to... If people were already invested in going to see it, that really helped. And I remember a big part of like Killers of the Flower Moon's press tour was just like Martin Scorsese going out there and doing all these really great long form interviews and doing like funny videos with his daughter on TikTok. Like, that kind of helped, right? I feel like that actually maybe was better than the way it would have been otherwise. But you're absolutely right that the strikes, like there had to kind of be like an already like pre-existing buy-in for audiences. But it's going to be very interesting now that we've kind of moved away from the strikes. What are going to be like the like the next steps forward for the industry?